Hey everybody, welcome back. It's Word Balloon, the comic book conversation show. John Suntra's here. I hope you had a great 4th weekend. What a weird thing when holidays fall on Tuesdays. I think, most companies are like, yeah, let's give them an extra day off. 5-day weekend? Yeesh, Jesus. Anyway, great show tonight on Word Balloon Live. I'm going to be talking to Joe Casey. He's got a brand new book out, Junior Baker, tied to his Butcher Baker book from back in the day. And we'll be talking about that and the writer's strike and a whole lot more. But in the meantime, I want to represent this wonderful conversation I had with Marty Pasko when he had the assignment of writing the text for the DC Vault. Do you remember the DC Vault? All those Vault book projects. There were a series of Vault books that came out from Running Press. They referred to it as a museum in a book because it would include reproductions of very interesting memorabilia, tchotchkes, you name it. And we discussed these with Marty, but Marty got the assignment to write the text for the book. And perfect choice. I mean, Marty also updated the Superman Encyclopedia back in the day. And we get into how he got the assignment and the kind of cool stuff that you could find. There's a Marvel Vault, there's a Spider-Man Vault, lots of these things. If you search eBay or third-party booksellers, you can still find it. You can even still find it brand new on Amazon. So if you're at all curious after hearing this about purchasing the DC Vault, those are some of the ways to find it. The DC Vault, we're cracking it open with Marty Pasko on today's Word Balloon.
Get ready for the ultimate comic book extravaganza. Terrificon is back at Mohegan Sun in Uncasville, Connecticut from July 28th to the 30th. Over 100 comic book creators, tons of celebrities, and hundreds of vendors all under one roof. Meet your favorite comic book writers and artists, mingle with celebrities from movies and TV, and explore a treasure trove of comics and collectibles. Terrificon, where dreams come true for comic book fans. Don't miss out July 28th to 30th at Mohegan Sun in Uncasville, Connecticut. Get your tickets now at Terrificon.com. Terrificon, the ultimate comic book experience.
Word Balloon is brought to you by my followers, the League of Word Balloon Listeners. That's the name I gave my followers through Patreon. Patreon.com/wordballoon. Listen, things are tough this year. I won't deny it for me financially. If you've ever considered supporting Word Balloon, I could really use your help. So if you think Word Balloon is worth the price of a comic book, even $1 a month would be greatly appreciated. Patreon.com/wordballoon. Thank you very much for your patronage and your attention, the League of Word Balloon listeners. If you subscribe to Word Balloon, I will send you an email that will have a domino mask and cape and a nice League of Word Balloon listeners emblem that you've seen here on Word Balloon as well. But thank you for your support. Patreon.com/wordballoon. Word Balloon is brought to you by AlexRossArt.com. Alex will be at San Diego Comic-Con in just a few weeks. His booth number is 2415. You can't miss the Alex Ross booth. Always this incredible gallery presentation of some of his most iconic covers and interiors, but also new stuff as well that you will likely see on your favorite comic covers in the months ahead. Make sure you check out AlexRossArt.com at San Diego Comic-Con, booth 2415. It's always very distinctly and gigantically located in the center of the action in San Diego on the main convention floor. Check it out or go online for AlexRossArt.com. How did you get the assignment of writing the text for the DC Vault?
Well, there are, I think the best way to answer that is to say that there are about 3 people, maybe, 3 or 4, who have an ongoing relationship with DC now, who have the kind of perspective on the history of the company that I do because of the length of my association.
Mm-hmm.
And the others weren't available.
Okay.
So it came to me. But what I think made them think of me for it was the fact that I'm a member of the last generation of people who have participated directly in the oral history by virtue of the people that I knew and worked with. So all of the research, and all of the arranging of the material was informed by having had conversations with Bill Finger, having known Bob Canada, having met Mort Weisinger, having talked to Julie Schwartz at a great length over the course of a close working relationship and personal relationship, and having a wealth of anecdotes. And I kept notes all those years. So a lot of what I was able to do with the text was place it in a context, I think, that the many other writers who have covered this material really didn't have, because it wasn't part of their personal experience.
Mm-hmm.
And fortunately, I proposed that we try to leverage that. Fortunately they went along with it. I also proposed that we not try to do a puff piece, but get as close as something that is produced in effect by the company that is the subject of the piece can be to a warts and all presentation of the material. And the reason for that is that a very candid view of the company's history is already out there in other reference texts.
Okay.
Jerry Jones's wonderful book Men of Tomorrow is a perfect example of that.
I agree.
And it would be, I felt, disingenuous to try to back away from that. The reality is what it is, and it's ancient history in so many cases, that really we didn't have to worry too much about coloring the fascinating truth, except in cases where there might have been legal issues, or obviously it was never my intent or anyone else's intent to malign anybody.
Okay.
And we wanted to be protective of the ongoing relationships that the company has. But what I'm saying is it was a real opportunity here to not only to present fascinating collectibles in recreation and in images of things that haven't been generally seen, and yet also be able to enhance it with some text that isn't coy, I guess is the best way to put it. And that's what we tried to do, and of course we'll leave it to the readers to decide whether we've succeeded.
Well, I've enjoyed reading it and also looking at all the different reproductions of the collectibles and other items. I mean, that was the beauty of the book that preceded it last year. I'm assuming the same company that made the Marvel Vault.
Yes, it's exactly the same team. The book packager, Becker and Mayer, who did a wonderful job of assembling all the collectibles, the imagery, and supervising the manufacture of the recreations in the plastic sleeves. And they packaged that for the publisher Running Press. The text and obviously the artifacts themselves were sourced by DC. But it isn't, per se, a DC publication. But yes, it's the same team that did the Marvel Ball.
Okay. And yeah, I almost wondered, Marty, if they, told you, hey, here, there's a closet. Start rifling through it. I mean, really, when you have a big company like this that has gone through the changes that it has over the decades, how much did you literally have to unearth some of these things? Or were you involved with that end of the production? I mean, I know you wrote the text, but how involved were you in terms of picking some of these things that were reproduced?
Not very much.
Okay.
This book is actually the work of a wonderful team of very dedicated and tireless people. And I if I start to mention names, I'll inevitably leave somebody out. The acknowledgement page is as dense as it is because I think pretty close to 100 different collectors helped to supply images from their personal collections, in addition to the material that was in the DC library. We had three guys, John Wells, Mark Wade, and Mike Tiefenbacher, who went over the manuscript with a fine-tooth comb for any errors and discrepancies. And in some cases, we had to make judgment calls because the parties couldn't agree, simply because a lot of this stuff hasn't been carefully documented, or whatever documentation there is has been, lost to history.
Okay.
So a lot of stuff is guesswork after the fact. but I think in 99.9% of the cases, the material is accurate. But it was a huge cast of people who got involved with pulling this stuff together, because you should know that what was submitted to Becker and Mayer to cherry pick from was something like twice as much, or if not 3 times as much material as what actually made it into the book.
Wow.
My original manuscript was twice as long.
No kidding.
Yeah, because we discovered pretty quickly into it that what we were trying to do was synopsize a company with a 75-year history, or 74 this year, it'll be 75 next year.
Okay.
In 20,000 words. And we knew that the challenge was going to be to hit all of the highlights and try to bring something new to the mix, a context, which we tried to do in the text with an historical context. And I don't just mean the history of the United States history, such as how the war affected publishing and so on, but rather also a history of popular culture. One of the things that always fascinated me is the trends in experimenting with different genres, for example, that went on in the period between the first golden age of superheroes and their revival in the late 50s. And I never had a sense until being called upon to put it all together of what drove the kind of experimentation that they did. For example, Lassie unexpectedly became a huge radio hit in 1948, and this led to a plethora of dog adventure comics from all kinds of publishers, and DC had 2 notable entries in that, one of which was a character, Streak the Wonder Dog, that knocked Green Lantern out of his own magazine.
Wow.
The whole Western trend was essentially started by the fact that in 1948, Hopalong Cassidy became a huge hit on television to kids because all of the feature films were released and were so successful that they did a whole new series of half-hour episodes. And then Gene Autry came to television, and Roy Rogers came to television. And in 1948, Dell Comics was publishing the most successful comic book distributed, Roy Rogers, exceeding Captain Marvel's sales at its height.
Wow.
Yeah.
Well, and wait, before you get off the dogs, because you mentioned Streak. Now, I'm assuming, was Rex the other big dog? Rex the Wonder Dog?
Exactly, yes.
Okay.
Yes, Rex, in fact, was just Streak painted white. Well, there was no master who was a superhero, but what I mean by that is it was the same essentially the same creative.
Sure.
Bob Kanigher writing it for Julie Schwartz as the editor.
Okay.
And in fact, that's a perfect example of something that we had to cut for length. We went on at some length of the original manuscripts talking about how hilarious these sentient animal comics were. To an adult sensibility in the modern age where, we know that we anthropomorphose our pets, but there's nothing probably going on in there, except blah 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 rover, blah 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 rover.
Sure.
So here you have all of these characters who can solve mysteries. So there's this, there's deductive reasoning going on, and they're dialing telephones with
their
with
nose.
pencils held between their jaws, and it's a hoot.
Wow.
It's a kind of flight of fancy that you just can't appreciate nowadays.
Well, now, and you mentioned how, as you say, pop culture trends would affect what kind of books were being made.
Sure.
And I think it's amazing that DC held the license to an incredible pop culture phenomenon, and it was barely acknowledged in their comic books. And it's good timing as well, because a new film is coming out in just a couple weeks, and that's James Bond.
Yes.
And can you explain how DC managed to reap millions off the licensing of the James Bond character?
Well, one of Jack Leibowitz's nephews was a gentleman by the name of J. Emmett, who started working for the company very, very early in his career in the mid-'50s. And Jay saw the potential of licensing, consumer product licensing, above and beyond what the company had already been successful with. There had always been a licensing program. But DC was always the visionary company in that it recognized before any of the other comics publishers that the thing that would carry them through the lean times, publishing sales are cyclical like anything else. They realized that what would carry them through those lean times would be a continuing revenue stream from licensing. And they got into that with cross-promotions with Kellogg's when Kellogg's was sponsoring the radio show. But radio was primarily, they were the first company into radio, followed quickly by Archie, actually Fox with the Blue Beetle radio show shortly before that. But DC was the first company into radio.
Wow.
And this had been, and they controlled the production themselves. It wasn't subcontracted.
So
and
DC
that's why
writers,
the TV the way it is. But I'm if you'll just bear with me.
Yeah, I want you to bounce around.
I want to get back to answering your question.
Absolutely.
Which is that what Jay saw was there was a great potential to expand on that in the consumer product category, and he was the first person to run a licensing department at that time for a comic book company that worked on models that are pretty much still operative today in terms of quality control. There had been a number, for example, of Superman costumes, Halloween costumes marketed to kids. But they weren't terribly accurate in terms of the way they recreated the costume.
Okay.
Emmett made a deal with Ben Cooper for an authentic-looking Superman Halloween costume, and it went through the roof. And that was the test case, and so Licensing Corporation of America, the division that the licensing department eventually became, was off and running.
I see.
But
Okay.
as part of his business model, he said, well, we basically, our big guns are Superman, Superman, and Superman.
Sure.
And Batman was a very close second. There were, at various points, Batman licenses. And of course, this is ironic because of what we now know today. But until 1966 and the craziness caused by that, or generated rather, by that television show, Batman was a distant second, and as was Wonder Woman.
Okay.
So they needed other things, and so he structured the company so that it wasn't just the licensing arm of DC Comics or National Periodicals, as it was called at the time, but rather what it was a licensing company. An agency, if you will, within the company,
Okay.
Independent from the core operations of the publisher. And that allowed, and when it was set up that way, they were also representing other properties. Among them, things that were in some way participated in or controlled by the other division of DC, which was independent news. We have not been able to find out from any documentation or research that we did whether there's a direct connection, but what we do know is Playboy magazine, distributed by Independent News, was the first publication in this country to expose the writings of Ian Fleming to the American public.
It was serialized in Playboy magazine, the James Bond stories. Yep.
Exactly. And the theory is, the supposition is that Emmett's team had their eye on Bond for a while and couldn't make anything happen with it. There was, of course, there is a component of sexual innuendo that was completely inappropriate under the Comics Code.
Certainly.
So that may explain why it wasn't a viable comic book. As you know, and I believe there is a reproduction of the cover in the vault, in the DC vault. They did a Dr. No comic book.
In Showcase, yes.
And it was not an adaptation of the film in the sense that Bob Brown's artwork did not render likenesses of Sean Connery or any of the other cast members.
Okay.
And it tanked, and conceivably because it was so diluted. It had to be so watered down.
Sure.
That it didn't really recognize the source material. But as part of the exploitation of James Bond, Emmett obtained the rights to the distinctive trench coat that James Bond wore. And the license on that, the official James Bond trench coat. And then all of the then all of the toys that came out of it.
Yes.
Toys for adults. The Aston Martin with all the various props and things built into it.
Oh, were the Corgi toys or the cars and stuff like that?
That I think came later.
Okay.
But what I'm saying is, when you make the initial deal for the license, you enumerate all the product categories, and you lay out at the very, very beginning what you have the right to represent.
Okay.
And in that sense, Emmett's team were visionary. And as we say in the book, by the time Steve Ross and his Kinney Services acquired National Periodicals, or NPP Inc. actually, it was called, because it was three separate divisions, it really wasn't the publishing operation that they were interested in so much, because, publishing is a low-margin business.
Yep.
What they wanted was the Licensing Corporation of America and Independent News, distributor of Playboy, Popular Mechanics, and several other the best-selling general interest magazines of the day.
Yeah, the top magazines, and that was my point, though, Marty, and I'm glad you said it, because it's the licensing division that really has been the engine since its development, and sometimes I think comic book fans forget that about their favorite comic book companies and the characters, and that they are trademarks and licensing properties at the end of the day. And the comic books are really just one component of it, and that really it is the lunchboxes and the bed sheets and the coloring books, and to the degree of other exploiting. For example, as you say, and I want to go back to this. Let's go.
The thing is, it is arguable whether that's true anymore, though.
Really?
Because it depends. You see, this is what I've always said to people who have frustrations with DC, for example, as freelancers. I'm often finding myself pointing out, no, your beef is not necessarily with DC Comics, and you're looking at DC differently. Because the company has such a well-known history, it is very, very easy to overlook the fact that it's not a small, privately held company anymore.
Sure.
I mean, I worked for that company in the 70s for a time, before my more recent tour of duty, and it was essentially six guys in a closet. But it is now a profitable division of a very profitable movie studio that is the division of the largest entertainment conglomerate on the planet. What am I saying? I'm saying that at every level within the managerial flowchart, people are looking at the company from a completely different perspective, with a different set of expectations. Comic book fans have a perspective on the company that's not dissimilar from that of the people who are working in the comics end of the business, and that's their bread and butter, and that's their daily life.
Sure.
So there's no real opportunity to correct that misperception. But it is difficult. If you're talking about DC as a company, as a publishing company, it's difficult to say it's dependent on the licensing.
Okay.
It justifies its existence to its corporate parent by creating new products to license.
Mm-hmm.
But the goal, if not necessarily the mandate of the company itself, is for the publishing ops, if possible, to support the company. And as we say in the book, that was the great goal that was in Jeanette Kahn's and Paul Levitz's mind when they became the head of the management team in the early 80s.
Okay.
Their big dream was to make the core business of the company a profit center rather than a loss leader. And they succeeded in that, and there have been a couple of speed bumps along the way since then, but that's pretty much, I think, where the company has been. But if you back up and you look at the big picture, and you say from a Time Warner or from a Warner Brothers perspective, what is DC? DC is an intellectual property library, and it exists to support the exploitation of that library in other media.
Okay.
But again, it's all about perspective. And from the world I come from, and I understand this because having worked in that end of the business, I'll talk about things like branded entertainment. And I'll talk about the Superman brand. And hardcore comic book people, especially on the editorial side, look at me as if I'm speaking a heresy, because I sound like one of the the licensing people.
Yeah, you're a suit now, man.
I mean, and there's no harm, no foul either way. But my point is just simply that the beast itself is so large now that you really can look at it from a number of different perspectives, and depending upon what division or department rather of DC you're in. You're like one of those, the blind men in the old, the Indian blind men in the old story, but they each have a part of the elephant.
Okay.
Do you know the story?
No.
You know that? Well, they're holding the trunk, and they say, "I have a beast that is as a snake."
Okay.
And the other one is holding the tail, and says, "Oh, I am holding an ox." And the idea is the thing is so vast, and they can't see. They just know their end of it.
Sure.
I don't know if any of this is making any sense.
No, no, it does, and I think it will open eyes to some hardcore fans that can't get beyond the monthly stories, and this is the answer to questions like, at the end of No Man's Land, why didn't they kill the Joker? I mean, my God, he's reached this point, and there's probably because there are people above that say, no, the Joker is a character that needs to still exist in the comic books so that we can continue to exploit him in our other pursuits. And thankfully that is the case, or else maybe Heath Ledger wouldn't have played the Joker in Batman Begins, or the latest Dark Knight movie.
By using the specific example of the Joker, a very exploitable character, obviously.
Yep.
What you bring to mind is another illustration of this idea of the differing perspectives. And the managerial philosophies that govern DC change, obviously, as management changes. And they change also as the potential exploitability of the material becomes apparent. What am I saying in a highfalutin way? Is that DC in recent years has moved away from being left alone to do its own thing, with the assumption that the comic book continuity is separate from the mass medium continuity, and because comic books are in a smaller playing field, it doesn't really matter all that much in the grand scheme of things whether there's a separate continuity. I mean, the classic Disney philosophy is, of course, that it's either on model or it isn't.
Okay.
And everything is executed in exactly the same way, top down. And in the early 90s, I remember when I was working for Warner Brothers Animation, there was a lot of consternation, and when they were developing Batman the Animated Series, about whether the Batman of the cartoon should wear black like the movie, or wear the gray and blue color scheme of the comics. And the original, there was a faction that thought, no, everything has to be uniform. You have to present one image. And then someone came along and said, well, wait a minute. We can actually get multiple different product lines. And so you have the kind of system that exists today, where there's a set of product that is tied into the movie, there's a set of product that's tied into the comics, there's a set of product that's tied into the cartoon version of the characters, and so on and so on.
Absolutely.
They finally go, oh, wait a minute, we're cutting our nose off to spite our face here.
Yep.
We can go for it all. And so what that spawned was a period, and that's when I worked for the company between 95 and 2005, where essentially the attitude was, let them do their thing with the comics, and we'll do our thing with the consumer products out here in California, and everybody's happy.
Okay.
In recent years, however, comic books, qua comic books, as opposed to, oh, this is just a pop cultural figure that we don't really know, was it television? Like when the Batman movie came out, people were going, well, oh yeah, it's based on the old TV series. No, it's based on the comic book. It was a comic book? Yeah. And you heard that kind of stuff.
Sure.
You're not going to hear that today, obviously. And now I'm getting the sense that there is more of an interest in having the comics reflect the larger incarnation of the material, meaning the more highly visible one of the mass media. And because that is a rich subject unto itself, one of the things we did in the book was de-emphasize the media. It's been covered, they felt, pretty much to death.
Okay.
In the form that it would have had to have been covered in this book, which is a it would have to be just a few passages about the media versions of things.
Okay.
A really interesting coverage of these characters in mass media is a book unto itself, and it's one I'd love to be involved in if it ever gets written someday. But we chose to focus on that level of just looking at the comic books and the publishing. But it's inescapable, and as you see in the book, so many of the evolutionary changes in the content of the publishing were driven by things in the media. So at least we have to cover some of that to give it a context. There's a chapter that talks about how DC survived the slower sales period of the 50s.
The post-war years, yes.
Beginning with the collapse of the superhero and before the superhero renaissance, and of course the disaster of the Comics Code.
Yes.
And the collapse of the primary comic book distributor in 1957. And when you talk about all of those things, you have to reference the media, so that is a part of it. But well, once again, I'm not sure what my point was.
No, I think this is all really interesting, and it does, as you say, it dovetails into how you cover these things in the DC vault. But as you say, obviously there's tons of comic book content, and there's tons of amazing reproductions of cover sketches by Joe Kubert and so many other wonderful artists. And I mean, really, the great thing too is the ash cans of various titles that didn't happen. And I want to ask you about one specifically, and I think it's Double Action.
Yes.
Now, I saw a sports illustration in that ash can, and I didn't see an artist identified, and I want to make a guess and say that that's Bill Gallo, because it sure looks like his stuff, and he's a very popular New York sports cartoonist who's done wonderful work in sports collectibles and has worked for, and I don't know specifically which papers he's worked for, but I know he used to work for one of the boxing magazines that I used to work for, and that's Boxing Illustrated. And
would he go back to 1940?
Yeah, he was a really young guy getting started. He's in his 70s now, and yeah, I think maybe I guess if it was the year 1940, it was WG was the initials next to the illustration, and it sure as hell looks like his stuff. Again, I could be wrong, but
well, I hate to cop out on you, but that really is the kind of question that those wonderful collectors and consultants that I mentioned.
Okay.
If anyone would know the answer to them, they would. But it reminds me of something that I meant to mention before, that the project began, the kickoff meeting began with Alan Asherman, the D.C. Archivist and manager of the library.
Okay.
Paul Levitz, myself, George Brewer of the design department, and Steve Corte, the in-house editor of this book. We had, by the way, some truly terrific editors on this book. Amy Whitteman at Becker and Mayer, and Steve Corte, a wonderful guy to work with. Totally unflappable. He routinely fields these daunting assignments with the greatest grace and equanimity, and I can't say enough good things about him. But Steve managed what could have easily become a very, very chaotic process without him, and in a beautiful way. What we did was we brainstormed, and we came out of that meeting with a 7-page list of things that could be included in the book. And the reason we had to start it that way was because so much of this stuff, so much of the kinds of stuff that you might be tempted to put into a book like this are already visible on the internet.
Okay.
Have already been reprinted. The goal was not just to produce the DC Vault, but to reach to the back of the DC Vault, to a corner of the DC Vault, and blow the dust off stuff that people haven't seen. Because unless you do that, you're not bringing too much new to the party.
Sure.
And that's not a negative at all. What that speaks to is the passionate interest in DC that so many people have. So they've gone to the trouble to find this stuff out. So it was a game of, we're going to get them with this one. They've never seen it, and what we did was we exploited the personal collections of people who were there. Julie Schwartz, in effect, bequeathed years and years and years of records to the company.
Okay.
And the ash cans, at least two of the ash cans, were from this little private stash that Paul had of things. I mean, the stuff is kept under lock and key and kept taken very, very seriously, obviously.
Sure.
Because only the company itself understands the value of this stuff on the collector's market.
Oh, absolutely.
And I'm sure, although I wasn't there observing it firsthand, I'm sure there was a lot of almost Mission Impossible kind of like intrigues, transporting things from various places. But, the most interesting thing about all the research was discovering that something that I'd always known, having grown up in this business in a sense, but never fully appreciated, which was how little regard the creators of the earliest material had for the idea that anyone would be interested in this stuff. And you've heard this over and over again.
Absolutely.
I remember when I was a kid, the first tour that I took of the DC offices, everybody was given a page of original art as a little memento. Why? Because they were just shredding it and throwing it out anyway, so they wanted to get rid of it somehow.
Do you still have yours from that tour?
Yeah, I have some dailies from the Batman syndicated strip. Most of you see, like I said, twice as many things were proposed as could actually fit in the book.
Yep.
And most of my stuff was on the media side.
Okay.
Like a button from a promotion done by WABC Radio in New York on the occasion of the opening of the Broadway musical It's a Bird, It's a Plane, It's Superman.
Okay.
A lot of stuff from the various custom comics and promotional things that I did on my last tour. And everybody who was invited to contribute had this kind of specialty. They had these little things that, and it really had to be ultimately up to Becker and Mayer and running press as to what was included. So there was a lot of stuff that I'm sure could fill up a DC Vault 2 if they ever wanted to do one. And it was frustrating only slightly, because you realized, well, there's no way we can include all of this stuff. So if you start saying, oh, gee, I wish we could have, but everybody has their mental list of things they would have liked to see in the book.
Well, definitely, but some of the things that were included, I'm glad, because I remember that Treasury Edition Superman dollar book, oversized book that came out in the 70s, and in it there was conceptual art from Neil Adams of a proposed Disneyland-like Superman amusement park to be built in my state, Illinois, at the tip of at the bottom of the state, and certainly Metropolis, Illinois, has its Superman celebration every year, and it's a wonderful thing. But man, Neil just drew this incredible thing, and I was 6 or 7 years old when I bought this comic, and I'm like, oh man, I can't wait till they build this. And there's a wonderful inclusion of the Hall of Villains. And you see people just looking at these statues of Mxyzptlk and Lex Luthor, and there's the Parasite and Brainiac.
Right.
It's, that's just one of the things that I remember seeing. But then in addition to that, you've got conceptual art from the Batman TV series. As we said, wonderful roughs of cover art, and, not only the obvious characters of the Trinity, like Superman, Batman, and Wonder Woman, but Captain Marvel, of course, Ragman, a great little piece of Joe Kubert art of a couple pages of Ragman. And then the best stuff, too, is the memos, and especially the inner office memos revolving around things like the Crisis. And I'll let you talk a little bit about that, because that is like, that's like finding the Ark, and that's like Indiana Jones finding the Ark and everything, and seeing the Rosetta Stone of the building blocks of what became one of the biggest events of DC Comics.
Well, as I said, we're indebted to a very large cast of contributors, of people who had hung on to things and made them available for the book. And it really is an astonishing example of collaboration among a very large group of people. But because in that 7-page list that we came out of the initial meeting with, it spawned so many other things. Because the minute you start to inquire about, well, does anything survive from such and such a project, you start getting, I have kept all my notes on this, or do you want that? People were suddenly offering us stuff. And so, I would say about half the stuff that ended up in the book was stuff that was anticipated, and the other half is stuff that was discovered in the course of putting the material together. And the original conversations were things like, to go back to your point about the crisis, or actually the one I'm thinking about is Mike Carlin's charts on the Death of Superman continuity.
That's cool. Absolutely. Go right ahead.
And that would be a case, if we sat in the room going, Paul, I remember seeing that, and I remember, and his attitude was, I remember being very impressed at the thoroughness of how they worked that out. And then the question was, I wonder if Mike still has that in his files, and every time a question like that was posed, the person would come back and say, yes, and I've got this, and I've got that, and I've got this, and then suddenly there was this embarrassment of riches, if you will.
10 more things when you were looking for one.
Yeah, and obviously the further back you go, the more amazing and impressive a lot of it is.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, that's the thing. I'm mentioning things that I think, current readers might appreciate, but, man, you're right. Like, for example, the guy before DC really became DC, Malcolm Wheeler Nicholson, the first publisher. I wanted to mention him because he, in his original publications, was kind of his own character. I mean, he had his own little adventures that he apparently would go on, and was writing about, his own experiences in the pulps that he printed, and also these early comic books. Am I correct?
Yes. Colorful does not begin to describe the picture of Malcolm Wheeler Nicholson that emerges from the research. But he is a beloved figure at DC. So one of my jobs was to reconcile the various conflicting impressions that we have of him from various writings, and also from the artifacts and the anecdotes themselves.
Mm-hmm.
But he certainly seems to have emerged as a person who was more of a storyteller and an adventurer, and a larger-than-life figure than a purse-string clutching businessman. And I think the picture that the book paints pretty much makes that clear.
Okay.
And I think you can argue that each of the three principals who founded the company, Wheeler Nicholson, Jack Leibowitz, and Harry Donenfeld, were each indispensable. They each had something to contribute that would not have created the company that emerged had they not all contributed in the measure that they did. I think each one of those people was indispensable to the success of the company. The difference may have been that Wheeler Nicholson was gambling, was throwing things against the wall to see what would stick.
Yep.
And Leibowitz and Donenfeld, by virtue of having been publishers and printers of a number of magazines, the early pulps, the racy men's pulps in particular, Spicy Detective.
Yeah, Spicy Detective, sure.
They had a greater sense of when to be risk-adverse and when not to be.
Okay.
Wait until you have sales figures for about 3 issues before you launch another title, that
sure.
kind of thing. But on the other hand, had Wheeler Nicholson not had impulses that another perspective might have seen as reckless, you wouldn't have had detective and action all occurring at the same time. Because by that point in 1937, when the other two partners were, taking over the control of the company, the need for a certain number of titles to launch new material, and the idea that you had to take those kinds of risks was already firmly established. I guess what I'm saying is I think Leibowitz on his own might have been too conservative. Donenfeld on his own would have focused more on just the physical manufacturing and the distribution channel.
Okay.
And Wheeler Nicholson on his own would have focused almost entirely on the creative, with a somewhat naive belief that only that and no marketing would drive product. So each of those men contributed equally to laying the foundation for the company that followed. But Wheeler Nicholson is a difficult figure to nail down because he was a self-mythologizer, even much more so than Jack Leibowitz.
Okay.
I'm sorry, rather Harry Donenfeld.
Okay.
And his descendants do have a relationship with the company.
Okay.
Their perception of this is, because this is like 3 or 4 generations on.
Sure.
My sense of it is that their perception of Wheeler Nicholson is itself kind of vague. So in a sense, as far as who this guy was, he gets the last laugh because he has been able to write his own legacy, and it is precisely the material that you're reacting to in your question.
The only evidence left are the stories that he left behind.
Exactly.
Interesting. And yeah, I mean, the other thing that I like too is because we know the editors that were keepers of certain characters. And if you go back, you know that Julie Schwartz was editing Superman. Before Julie, it was Mort Weisinger. Before Mort, it was Whitney Ellsworth. Am I correct?
Well, Whitney Ellsworth was a line editor only for a relatively brief period of time.
Okay.
What Whitney Ellsworth was effectively by as early as, I think, 1941, when Mort Weisinger joined the company, was the editorial director. But they didn't have that title, per se.
Okay.
The first person to have that title was Harry Donenfeld's son, Irwin, who came to the company in 1948. What Whit Ellsworth did was coordinate the editorial assignments, set up the structure by which the material was produced, and the workloads were distributed across several different editors in terms of character franchise. So there weren't those kinds of editorial fiefdoms that you're thinking of as you frame your question.
I see.
Yes,
okay.
Mort Weisinger was the editor of Superman, but he did not consolidate his control over that character until around 1950.
Okay.
Because up until that point, Jack Schiff edited the Superboy titles. Throughout the 50s, Jack Schiff edited the Superboy titles.
Okay.
But the Superman titles were consolidated under Mort. And throughout the 50s, there was this gradual shift. But it really wasn't until the height of the success of the television series, like mid-50s, 54, 55. And, of course, by that point, Mort is already the story editor of the Superman television series, that all the Superman material was brought together under Mort. And all the Batman material was brought together under Jack Schiff.
Okay.
But there was a real strong sense, I think, on Whit Ellsworth's part, that you don't want to concentrate too much power in terms of control over a franchise in one editorial office. And as Whit Ellsworth, essentially was divorced from any involvement in the publications from about 1952 onward because he was producing the television series.
Well, yeah, that's what I was wondering. That through line in terms of when he went to Hollywood, and really, that's, as you say, it's interesting that the company had control of how the properties were exploited in the media, and I know I am curious about that. And you started with the radio show. I want to talk about that for a second because before we get back to TV, because as you say, Kellogg's came in with Pep, and the Superman serial began. And I don't mean the crunchy cereal. I mean the adventures, the children's episodic show.
Well, actually, Superman had been on the radio for a little over 2 years before Kellogg's actually got involved.
Okay.
It began as a local program in New York, sponsored by an obscure oatmeal company. Is how we put it. I can't remember the name of the company. But anyway, and it ran locally, and then it was syndicated on transcription disc.
So it wasn't. Go ahead. Out of where?
Out of WOR.
Okay.
And then it took them 2 years because everything moved much more slowly in those days for a major sponsor to pick them up, and then they went national on the Mutual Network.
Yes, which WOR was a part of. It was WOR in New York, WGN in Chicago, and WXYZ, now WXYT in Detroit. I know they were three of the hubs that provided a lot of the programming.
Were they Mutual?
Yes.
Are you talking about the station out of Detroit that produced the Green?
Yes.
Stan Stryker created the Green Hornet for. And all that
actually, I should take that back. They were part of the Blue Network, weren't they? Well, actually, this is where my old time radio fandom kicks in.
Oh, don't get me started. We'll digress, and you'll have so much editing to do.
No, it's all superhero talk, so it's okay. It works.
Well, that's a subject that's dear to my heart too. But anyway,
I noticed that more and more with a lot of writers and artists that I speak to of your age and my age and older, I should say. Forgive me, Marty, because I know you're older, but it's okay. But no, I agree. I think old radio is great. But I want to ask, because you mentioned it in the book. There was a writer for the Superman radio show, and his last name was Kennedy. I want to say, was it Sterling Kennedy or something like that? But he helped.
Actually, no, I know what you're referring to. A man by the name of Stetson Kennedy.
Thank you.
Who was actually a political activist.
Yes.
He was not a writer. He was a spy, if you will, in a sense, for the Superman radio show. In the sense that what he had done is he had gone undercover and infiltrated a Ku Klux Klan cell, and lived to write about the inner workings, the rituals, and so on. And he's credited with being one of the first journalists among a group of them to shed a certain harsh light and a certain degree of close scrutiny and get away with it. To the KKK. And what he did was he fed a lot of details of how they work and the mentality and so on to writers for the radio show. And they produced a week of continuity, because the shows were 15 minutes, called Night of the Fiery Cross, I believe. Or Clan of the Fiery Cross. I don't have my notes
no problem.
in front of me, obviously. But something to that effect. And that became the first, arguably the first, maybe not the first, but certainly one of the first indictments of organized racial discrimination in a children's medium. And I don't know what the awards that it won were. I knew it did win awards, but I'm not sure if, the Peabodys were around at that time. But that we cite that in the book as one of a number of early examples of the pro-social or social consciousness orientation of DC, that although comics fans today look upon the institution of the Comics Code as a really dark and sad chapter in comics, much the way I suppose liberals look at McCarthyism.
Sure.
The fact remains that DC was uniquely positioned to accommodate the kinds of concerns that made the comic book companies more viable, or rather, I should say, less objectionable.
Absolutely.
In the late 50s, and it came by it honestly. One of the great ironies that we talk about in the book, and of course Jerry Jones and his goes on at great length about this, is that Jack Leibowitz actually began life as a socialist, a dedicated socialist. He also happened to be a CPA who put himself through business school at New York University by working as an accountant. A paradox, to be sure.
That's outstanding.
But that kind of social conscience that he represented, and a concern about what was respectable, and being acutely aware that children were impressionable, that drove a lot of DC's decision making. And then, of course, when Jack Schiff came aboard, he was perhaps the most, I don't want to say bleeding heart, because that's usually construed as a pejorative. I don't mean it that way. But he was considered to be among the staff the most sensitive to these kinds of things, and he was always the first to volunteer for any of the more progressive things that they were trying to do. There was I don't think that the plate from Johnny Everyman made it into the book, but there was a series in World's Finest called Johnny Everyman, which was essentially a plea for tolerance I mean, it was an argument. The entire series was an argument for respect for cultural diversity, some 40 years ahead of its time.
Wow. Yeah.
And one of the advisors to DC was Pearl S. Buck, a Nobel laureate.
Oh my God. Yeah.
You know. Oh yeah. They took that kind of stuff very seriously. But what you can't really know this many years after the fact is how much of that was driven by a social consciousness exclusively, or how much of it was driven by, fear of reprisal and the need to cover your you-know-what. And I suspect it's a little bit of both, but as I said, I think, most of it really was born of a belief that you were doing a good work in presenting certain ideas to kids. And as, of course, as we know, especially as we got into the 50s, the idea of teaching kids good citizenship was very much part of the coin of the realm,
Yeah, that's the interesting thing, how things started off a more editorial, with more of an adult editorial kind of bent. Superman kind of fighting for the common man, as he did in especially the very early years of action, and how it, as you say, morphed into a way to teach children how to behave and act properly in a social manner. And it is interesting that those things were going on, and then yet, as we all know, in the 50s, Dr. Wortham comes along and suddenly says, hey, Bruce and Dick, man, I don't know, I think that's kind of a queer relationship. And, and suddenly finds all these little hidden meanings. Although, there's that, but then, and I don't know about this, did Wortham really get into the Wonder Woman craziness that is kind of self-evident in some of the art that still exists from the 40s, and kind of the S&M quality that the book had back then?
Seduction of the Innocent itself covers a great deal of territory in a comparatively slim volume.
Okay.
And I say comparatively, what I mean by that is exhaustive treatises in hardcovers on the subject of comic books are much more commonplace today than they were in 1948.
Mm-hmm.
I remember for the longest time in most public libraries there were exactly 2 books, and 2 books only on comic books that you could find.
Jules Pfeiffer and who else?
No,
Oh.
I'm talking
way back.
about material published a good 20 years before Jules Pfeiffer.
Oh, okay, I'm thinking the Great Comic Book Heroes. Go ahead.
Keaton was the comics, published in 1948.
Say that title again.
The Comics.
Okay.
But the author is Colton Waugh, W-A-U-G-H. It's out of print. It's a very obscure book. But it was published in the same year as Seduction of the Innocent. And like Seduction of the Innocent, Waugh's book is a very thin volume. But it not only covers comic books, it covers comic strips. And the same kind of striking a glancing blow to every subject approach is evident in Seduction of the Innocent. The oft-quoted lines about Superman being a Nietzschean power fantasy with disturbing Aryan overtones, and the line about the Batman and Robin being the wish dream of 2 homosexuals living together. These have been quoted over and over again, over the 50-plus years since the book first saw print.
Sure.
But they are also pretty much the only things he says in the book about either Superman or Batman. I don't recall him mentioning Wonder Woman.
Okay.
But that just may be because I didn't need to consult those sections of the book for the research. Pretty much all of the Wonder Woman stuff has been documented by Les Daniels. And so in that case, it was just a matter of, fact-checking, seeing was there anything left out, stuff that you could, that hadn't been gotten right.
Okay.
And the only thing that I was able to contribute beyond that, really, was to be able to talk about it in somewhat franker language. Les would describe the things, and he would quote liberally from the correspondence. I'm talking about, he did 2 books. They're wonderful books, by the way. They are about Wonder Woman exclusively. And he's able, because of the space he has, to go into a great deal more detail. But one of the things that isn't really touched on quite as much is the nervousness that was engendered by some of that early material. Certainly, more people know more about alternative sexuality, bondage and discipline. I don't want to say S&M. That really wasn't an element of the material.
Okay.
But people know more about that today in the general public than did then. So it was a lot easier for some of the stranger overtones of that material to go unnoticed. But you got the sense that they were always worrying. It drove Shelley Mayer to distraction to the point, and this is something that we couldn't get into the book, it drove Shelley Mayer to such distraction that he hired an editor whose exclusive job was, this was before Bob Canada came aboard.
Okay.
Because Bob got involved with Wonder Woman after Marston died.
Right.
The creator of Wonder Woman.
Yes.
Marston. He hired a woman named Dorothy Rubicek, who was known as primarily as the romance editor Dorothy Woolfolk when she came back to DC about 20 years later.
Okay.
And Dorothy's entire job was sending letters to William Moulton Marston that consisted essentially of, no, you can't do that. We'll get in trouble.
I understand. This was material for children, so you'll forgive my laughing, but you can't help it now as an adult.
And you see when he dies and Kanigher takes over, and it's all documented in visuals in the DC vault. You go from these covers of the bullets and bracelets and the lasso binding people and chains. The Amazon women are enslaved and they're tied up in chains.
Sure.
You go from all of these covers to suddenly these static shots drawn by Bob Oxner in his best teen comedy style of Steve Trevor showing up in front of Wonder Woman with a bouquet of flowers, and she's standing there poised coyly, and you half expect to see cartoon hearts around her head. They stopped just short of that.
Well, they were very much like the Lois Lane books. And really, unfortunately, to the detriment of Wonder Woman's characterization, she did kind of, there was that component of, what do I do about my boyfriend Steve, as opposed to being the hero that she has, become again today. And thankfully, the effort is there to make the women heroes as important as men heroes and everything. And we've got cool people like Greg Rucka and Gail Simone and Phil Jimenez and George Perez and all the people that have really helped redefine the character in the last 25 years. So, oh well.
Well, I think you have to give the lion's share of the credit to making that character viable ultimately to Karen Berger and George Perez.
Very cool.
I'm sorry?
No, I'm saying, please go ahead.
And that may be one of the more impressive accomplishments that DC has been able to pull off, was to take this character that was so well known, yet in terms of strict bottom line dollars and cents, never a tremendous performer, but had to continue to be published at various points in its history for overriding concerns. For example, it was at one point in its history it was losing money domestically, but it was doing very well overseas, so they couldn't cancel it. And there was a rights reversion clause in the deal, where if DC stopped publishing Wonder Woman for any particular length of time, all rights would revert to the Marston estate.
Wow. Okay. Well, there you go. And therein is another interesting wrinkle about the company. As you say, just if you don't use the character, it could revert back to, and obviously that was the specific contract, I'm assuming, with the Marston family?
Yeah, that was a specific, or rather I should say a unique case. So that was part of the deal that Charlie Gaines made.
Okay. You go into detail as well. I should mention, as you mentioned, Charlie Gaines, the All-American line versus the National line, and the merging of the two lines eventually. And as you say, Wonder Woman was an All-American character, a Gaines character. Green Lantern was, The Flash was. Those are the three big ones that I can think of offhand.
And because, to the best of our knowledge, and remember, again, we had a whole team of people doing the research on this, we don't have copies of contracts to shed any light on some of this stuff. But the interrelationship between All-American and DC was extremely complex. And to this day, we are not able to completely unravel it because we don't have the contracts that spell out what exactly the relationship was. I just do remember Julie Schwartz telling me so many times that we never understood ourselves what the connection between the two companies were. We just knew that the characters showed up in each other's books from time to time. We didn't know how that worked. And I remember the way Julie described it to me once. He said, one day I was working in the All-American offices. And then another day we moved, and instead of everybody on my floor being an All-American editor, suddenly I was working, down the hall from Mort. Now, Mort Weisinger had been his childhood friend, but they didn't actually work together, or rather work in the same physical space for a few years. And the way he described it was this way one day, it was another way the next day. We never really knew why, but the thing that keeps coming back to me, and this goes back to what I was saying earlier about how little people took any of this stuff seriously. It was a job.
Sure.
It might have been a fun job for some people, but you always got the impression that it wasn't really what they wanted to do. The earliest comic book artists were failed strip cartoonists.
Absolutely. Or magazine illustrators, for that matter.
Yes,
some of the finer ones.
There was such a thing as magazine illustration.
Sure.
Comics were the thing to fill in between those advertising jobs that really paid the rent. So all the history is informed by the overriding sense, and I'm talking about just like the first 30 years of the business. All of this started to change by the mid-'60s. But prior to that, all of the history, how much or how little of it there is and how reliable it is due to the fact that all the thinking about this kind of thing, when it comes to keeping records and so forth, was driven by a sense of, well, nobody's going to care about this. Who gives a shit?
Sure. Yeah, it's just comics. Yeah.
Well, and you mentioned Whitney Ellsworth. The main confusion about Ellsworth's role, and the main reason why most people who paid attention to indicias in old comic books think that he had more of a role to play in the publishing operations in the 50s than he actually did, was that his name, he's listed as editor in the book. He's not the actual editor in the sense of a line editor. He's more of a supervising editor, and his is the only credit in the book. And this continues for approximately 8 years when he's not even doing that job.
And I think magnified by the fact that if you watch the Superman show, he is the only name.
He's the only producer, yes.
Exactly.
He's out on the coast full time. But point is, I always assumed that there must have been horrible resentment on the part of the editors that they didn't get any credit for their work.
Yeah, no kidding.
Well, that turns out not to have been the case. At least as far as Julie Schwartz was concerned, Murray Boltinoff never claimed to care. I asked him about that once. But Murray was the kind of guy where you got the feeling that if it bothered him, he wouldn't say anything about it because he thought, well, maybe I'm being petty and I shouldn't,
Okay.
But Julie's attitude was, we didn't care. A raise would have been better than having our names printed in the indicia.
Sure.
But everybody will, says that in a business where there isn't the opportunity to feel like a demi-celebrity. But once the fans came along in the mid-'60s and they started paying close attention, and DC perhaps belatedly recognized that there was a potential commercial value in publishing the credits on the books, as Stan Lee had been doing for about 7 or 8 years prior to that.
Mm-hmm.
Until all of that happened, you get this sense that the pioneers of the business were toiling in anonymity and were just as happy to have it that way. With a few rare exceptions, and those are the ones who are known as personalities, and they're usually on the talent side rather than on the editorial or managerial side. Certainly Bob Kane had a very finely developed sense of self-promotion.
Absolutely.
Early on.
Yeah, that is the interesting thing, and you see that in the book, that he was one of those few artists that would truly sign the front page of every feature. And there was his name, Bob Kane. I think that's amazing. And we all hear the stories about Bob Kane, of course. And, did you...
I heard quite a few from Bill Finger, actually.
Well, that's... I wanted to ask, because you mentioned that you knew Bill Finger and everything. And what about that whole Batman dynamic of Bill Kane, Bob Finger, Shelley Maldenoff, all those guys that were working.
I had a 2-hour conversation with Bill Finger in like 1973. He had come up to the office to pick up some kind of check.
Okay.
But he wasn't actually writing for the company, so I don't know what was going on there. I think he might have done some work for a reprint thing, like an introduction or a text page or something.
Okay.
And that was another thing we discovered, by the way, just briefly, was that there's this huge stack of unpublished material that we didn't have, they couldn't be reproduced, but we drew on heavily in the research. And what they are the first-person accounts of the creation of things by various individuals. But I don't think this was what he was there for, but I got his take on the creation of Batman. Because, I was so astonished to be, sitting in this bullpen. Now, he's waiting to see an editor. I'm just working there out in the open in a cubicle. And that was the other thing that was so amazing about working at DC in the early 70s, was how accessible so many of these people who would be lionized at conventions only a few years later were. And you always had this sense that they were kind of mystified that suddenly, there were all these people who were interested. And you've seen that in more recent years. I think Martin Nodell came to that kind of late.
Yeah.
Realizing that there were a whole bunch of people out there who were, really jazzed would have been jazzed to meet the guy who created Green Lantern.
Absolutely.
And you see these guys at the conventions today, even. One of the things that's amazing, the Craig Flessel, do you know that name?
Yes, I do. That's one of the names in the DC Vault, absolutely. One of the Golden Age artists. Wonderful
He's still
artist.
alive.
No kidding. Oh, my God.
He was one of the consultants on this book. Steve Corte, our editor, dealt directly with Craig.
Wow.
Yes. So, we had access of the memories of people who were working for the company in 1935. It's amazing the way fate works. But anyway, the story of the creation of Batman is essentially the one I heard from Bill Finger. It is supported by other accounts, but of course it's all anecdotal, and Bob Kane is no longer with us to speak to it. So what we had to do, of course, was to be very careful that this was their recollection. But the story that we tell, and I don't want to give it away for someone who's going to read the book.
Absolutely.
But it is that essentially you get the impression that Kane had a very vague concept for Batman, and with Bill's help, detail upon detail, was sort of fed to him or strongly suggested by Bill, and over a laborious give and take process or trial and error process over a weekend, they came up with the concept. And because of the deals that were struck and the fact that the material always bore Kane's signature, there's always been a feeling among fans that perhaps we don't know what the exact nature of the origin of the character is.
Wow.
And of course, as we all know, memory idealizes. There's a very strong self-aggrandizing or promotional streak in all of us. And I think it's just human nature to run the risk of overstating your contribution to something when you talk about something. So it's one of the interesting challenges of the book, and I will leave it to the readers to decide whether it's been met or not, was to present these new takes or these different takes or these little herd takes on the origin of some of this material because of its own interest value, without necessarily presenting it as gospel truth or history. And that was important to us because the pockets of memory of these various people, to the extent that it's been recorded and still survives, is as much a corner of a vault as any of the artifacts in the book itself.
Very cool. I wanted to ask about, and as we're talking about the Batman world, one creator in the 70s that had a lot, and late 60s, that had a lot to do with Batman, who was a comic strip artist on his own and did some work for Marvel as well. But I think wrote a lot of interesting stories, not just for Batman, but also on some of the war titles as well. Frank Robbins.
I knew that was going to be the name.
Because I really think he's one of the forgotten guys when it comes to a lot of the Batman stuff. And I think he really, as I'm starting to reread a lot of the reprinted material that's been in the showcase books and I just become more and more aware of what he was doing for both companies in the 70s. It's like, man, you really never hear about what Frank Robbins was doing. All you ever hear is the comic strip fans who know Johnny Hazard and compare his work to Milton Caniff and that stuff. But yeah, tell me about Frank Robbins.
Oh, okay. Frank, I only met Frank once.
Okay.
In Julie's office. And Frank was one of those people who had an amazing memory for people's names and what he heard they'd said about him. I remember, this is all I remember about Frank personally. I can tell you a little bit more about him. But when he first started working as a writer for Julie Schwartz, and not as an artist, and that was in the late 60s when Andrew and Esposito had started drawing The Flash.
Okay.
And Frank Robbins started at about 1968 in The Flash. And there was a bio mentioned that he had worked for RKO Studios. And that's all he said. And in my, I was a kid, and in my, the fanboy presumptuousness was there. I automatically assumed that he was a screenwriter. And I wrote some letter of comment. I said something about, the former RKO screenwriter, Frank Robbins. So he comes into the office. The very first thing he's introduced, he goes, look, he's Martin Pasko. I know that. I never worked for RKO as a screenwriter. And I'm like, whoa, what are you talking? I have this vague recollection of having, written this letter some 6 or 7 years later. And we laughed, and it was a very, very pleasant conversation. And what struck me about Frank was that he was, again, like so many of these people, totally self-effacing and not in an ingratiating way, but in a very sincere and honest way. He was just very matter-of-fact about the things that he had done. But by the time I had met him, I had also had done enough reading and self-education on the whole syndicated strip area to understand who he was. Former assistant of Noel Sickles, who is a giant in that field.
Unbelievable, absolutely.
Is the primary influence of Milton Caniff, and from there spawned was a seminal influence, therefore, on a number of people who are considered gods among classic comic book art fans. Alex Toth, Carmine Infantino. All of these people have branched out on their own in their own very distinct styles. But if you look at the material of the late 40s, you see that Carmine, Alex Toth, I'm blanking on a lot of their names. There's a whole group of them, and they're almost all inked by Frank Giacoya, and the art all looks very much alike.
Okay.
It is all heavily influenced by Noel Sickles. You look at Johnny Hazard, and you see exactly the same kind of thing, except in the syndicated strip area. And Frank, as an artist, was one of those lucky people who didn't have to do the comics because he was on a successful syndicated strip, and that was the nirvana, as we point out in the book, that all the cartoonists of that era aspired to.
Yep.
But Frank was part of the influx of talent that Carmine Infantino engineered when he took over. The editors were primarily people with writing backgrounds when they worked under Irwin Donenfeld. Carmine represented the first time someone with an art background, somebody who had actually created the product, was in charge of the staffing and made suggestions about who to get to do various things. And he brought a lot of people. He and Joe Orlando brought a lot of really talented people back into the fold in the late 60s and early 70s. And Frank was one of the first people, I think, to discover what a lot of guys in recent years, like Howard Chaykin, Howard. I just automatically think of him as, Howie. But anyway,
I understand.
No, he prefers to be called Howard. Anyway,
all right.
Howard has discovered in recent years that it can be just as gratifying to write rather than to draw, and you can do it faster and do more of it. And so I think Frank was perfectly happy to be a writer. But what I know as to the contribution to Batman, it endures today. He created Man-Bat.
There you go.
He created a whole number of other characters that are still part of the DC continuity, but in lesser in lesser roles. But I know what you mean about his art, but it was so idiosyncratic by comparison to what comic book fans were used to, that I recall that it was viewed very much as an acquired taste at the time.
I completely understand. I was one of those kids in the 70s that was like, what is this? And yet I kept buying the books. I mean, I loved his run on the Invaders, and it was a crazy-looking Captain America and Namor and all of them, but you really do, as you get older, you appreciate it more and more. And
well, if you become, as I've had to out of necessity, just to keep myself viable in the industry, more art literate, you look at this stuff through a whole different set of eyes when you revisit it 30 years later.
Yep.
And you look at, oh my God, it's film noir and jump cuts.
Yep.
It's look at the way that's lighted. Look at the way the blacks are spotted. Oh my goodness. But when you're a kid, you're just focusing on the things that disorient you, like that odd habit he would have of not creating points on the balloon tails. With the balloon tails would just sort of disappear behind people's heads. And if you look at this stuff where he was allowed to do the balloon shapes as opposed to the letterer, you'll see that, and it's when you. I don't want to get into an argument for elitism, but there's something to be said for an informed opinion, as opposed to that just looks funny,
Absolutely. No, that's great, man.
Poor John's sitting there going, "Oh Christ, I got to cut." Oh,
no,
God.
Marty, don't kid yourself, man. This is all going in. This is great, and no, because this is what people need to understand. I mean, I really one of the reasons why I appreciate talking to people of, and I'm sorry, I don't mean to keep aging you, but people that worked when you did, your generation, is they have to know what happened before 1990. And I think that a lot of younger readers don't know the interesting stories and how we got to where we are now. The only way you understand that is if you understand what happened before, and that's why a book like the DC Vault is a wonderful, example to look at and really appreciate all the different evolutions of the company and where people started and how things turned out and where they are today. It's great. I mean, you've got a page of Spy in there. The Siegel-Schuster feature that was in, I'm assuming, Detective, that was pre-Superman.
I'm sorry.
It's called Spy. Spy, Siegel and Schuster's.
Right. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I mean, and there's examples there, and there's a wonderful little section where I forget the protagonist's name, but you see him and you see the heroine, and there are flashes of Clark and Lois in those depictions of these characters in Spy. Or you mentioned how Noel Sickles was such an influence on all these wonderful artists that we do know, like Alex Toth and Infantino and Frank Robbins. But I wanted to ask, too, about, Roy Crane. And it sounds like Roy Crane was a very early influence on a lot of the first generation of the Golden Age comic book artists and stuff. And what was it?
I'm sorry. Is that Captain Jack? No, that was Zach.
Is it Wash Tubbs or
Roy Crane? I'm trying to remember.
Isn't it Roy Crane?
I know the name, and I'm seeing the art, but I can't. I'm blanking on what.
I think it's Wash. I want to say Wash Tubbs, or I'm not even sure. They see now this part we can cut out if it's going nowhere.
I have when the image that pops into my head of Roy Crane is someone who was not a very detailed renderer. The images were not exactly cartoony. They were naturalistic, but they were very open. And I keep seeing a face in my head that looks like an American Tintin. And I could be completely out of my brain. I have absolutely no idea. No, I mean...
Well, let me ask you about a specific era that you were one of the flies on the wall, and that is during the DC implosion of the late 70s. And you kind of, I think, touched on that when you mentioned Jeanette and Paul's importance in showing the company what it could be. I mean, were things like that period, and I've seen Stephen Grant mention this in a lot of his columns that he writes online, that people don't understand that DC came very close to stop publishing comics and just, we don't really need the comic books. Let's just stick to the licensing and stuff. Can you talk about that period and what Paul and Jeanette were able to convince the others about? If I'm getting this correct, as far as the people and...
Well, I think a number of different things that, for people of my, and I hate the phrase, generation in this business, think of as separate. I think you're conflating them.
Okay,
the
please.
DC implosion is a term that I associate very, very specifically with one moment in time when an expansion effort was made, a very aggressive expansion effort was made based on projections from current sales. And then there was a lot of surprise information at the 11th hour that suggested that a more prudent business model should be applied, and maybe this is not the right time to grow the line that much.
And things
that moment in time is remembered primarily for having spawned the rare collectible Canceled Comics Cavalcade.
Right.
Because there was this huge volume of material that had been created. Remember, this was also when the dollar comics were also,
absolutely
started, if I'm not mistaken.
Late 70s, like 78, 79?
Right. Yeah. But what its impact has on the goal of making the comic book business, the publishing, the core business, profitable in and of itself, without being reliant on ancillary revenue streams. The delay in information under the old consignment method of distribution, where you didn't have final sales figures until 6 months at a minimum after the off-sale date of any particular comic book,
okay,
was thought at the time, accurately or not I can't say, but was thought at the time to have been one of the causes of the DC implosion. Late-breaking information that was an unpleasant surprise. That trauma, plus the fact that the business always knew that it was essentially publishing 3 copies of everything for every one it sold, led to the belief that a greater emphasis on product for this burgeoning new thing called the comic book shop, which in the late 70s was just getting started in a couple of isolated places around the country.
Mm-hmm.
And, of course, DC was experimenting with its own direct sales with a thing called the comic book mobile, or the comic mobile, which was essentially the equivalent of a traveling library, a bookmobile.
Sure.
Except it was comic books, and they weren't being loaned, they were being sold.
Huh.
And that was just done locally in New York, and it was kind of a test.
Okay.
And I think ultimately they backed away from it because they felt it really wasn't good business to essentially be competing, in essence, with their own distributors, no matter on how small a scale.
Okay, I can see that, sure.
But all of these things made people start to think, well, maybe there's a different way of doing things. And Marvel was having some of the same thoughts a little bit later. My read of history, my recollection was that DC took most of the gambles, and then Marvel just followed suit.
Okay.
And in some cases, beat DC at its own game, but that's a separate book.
Okay.
So in that sense, the DC implosion did have a factor in the drive to come up with new business models, and it really wasn't until what is now called ID distribution, or distribution at newsstands under the consignment method, returnable, was de-emphasized, and the lion's share of the sales were being done through the direct market, which evolved throughout the early 80s and started to become the industry standard, the primary way in which the material was distributed by the late 80s, 87 or so.
Sure.
The DC implosion of the late 70s had some role in that. But what you speak of about thinking of the licensing as the primary revenue and thinking of the management of the merchandising and the licensing as the core business rather than the publishing, I'm not so sure that was ever actually the case.
Okay.
It was sort of like, well, we know our core business is publishing, But we also know we can't make as much money out of it, so there's always this search for what we need is the next Superman, what we need is the next Batman, we need the next breakout hit that will drive all of this product, so that if, Anthro coughs up blood when it shows up on the stands, it's not, the end of the world.
Sure.
And by, I think, the late 70s, at the time of the transition from Carmine to Jeanette Kahn, that way of thinking about the business model was traditional. It was about 20 years old by that point. So many publishers who didn't have licensing programs had fallen by the wayside. And two of the two publishers who had the most robust program in that area, MLJ or Archie, and DC, of course, were the ones that were, in a lot of cases, the last man standing. And as we say as we chronicle in the DC Vault, after American distribution went under in 1957, Martin Goodman was of Marvel, or at that time, I guess, Timely Atlas, was left without a distributor, and he had to turn to Leibowitz,
his competitor,
and his independent news to distribute his comics. So, in that sense, Archie and DC were the kind of like the last men standing.
Wow.
And not coincidentally, they were also the driving forces behind the creation of the Comics Code. And one of the things that has always had me scratching my head is why Marvel did not come to the party in terms of trying to aggressively exploit their library in mass media until so late in the game, like 1966 or 67.
Right, with the Bashki Spider-Man cartoon and the Marvel Superheroes wheel, things like that, and of course all the coloring books and everything else, I guess.
But the answer that you usually hear is to that question is, well, don't forget the franchises and properties that are considered to be the Marvel stars, such as Spider-Man and Fantastic Four and so on, weren't really created until 59 or 60.
Right.
In the resurgence of the superheroes that the Justice League and all of the the Earth 2 retconning, you know what I'm talking about.
Absolutely.
Superheroes.
Yeah,
drove all of that. But the fact is, not all the Marvel superheroes were created by Stan in 1960 or 1950.
No, it took a couple of years.
There was Submariner. There was Captain Marvel. Captain America. Maybe not too many more, but there were other properties, and there was more of a history there. So, I guess what I'm wondering is it really as simple as what it seems to be on the face of it, which is that it's just a matter of some people having a vision and other people not. The only other publisher, as I said earlier, in the early 40s, who understood the value of getting a radio presence for the material, and that would hopefully drive comic book sales, was Fox, the company that was the publisher of the Blue Beetle in 1940. Now, there was a syndicated Blue Beetle radio show for about 2 years, and then it disappeared. And that's a case of someone who had the right idea, but couldn't make it work, because Fox itself had a pretty troubled history as a publisher and didn't last very long. But why Marvel did not earlier embrace the goal of creating a media presence, I've never fully understood, because it looked like there wasn't a lot of energy devoted to that, even after they were arguably the number 2, publisher of comics, which was in the early 60s. But then again, you get a different perspective if you're superhero centric than if you're not. Because if you're looking at all comics, you might argue that the second, and perhaps Whitman Publishing might have said the first, the primary publisher of comics, even in the early 60s, was Dell and later Gold Key. They're all the same company, I believe.
Right.
But if you're just talking superhero terms, then it's really just DC and Marvel, pretty much from 59 through, I guess, the mid 80s.
Well, and I guess now, it sounds like, especially what we heard this summer, from the top at Warner Films, the film division, it sounds like maybe they are realizing the mistakes they made with Superman Returns, and that it is important to have even more input from the comic book division, seeing the success across the street that Marvel has had. Now that they, in the case of Marvel films, obviously it starts with the publisher, and they've created their own film company, whereas DC is a component of Warner Films, and in a lot of ways is no different than some of those other subheadings of film divisions underneath Warner. And I'm blanking right now on some of the names of them, but
you're talking about the other imprints?
Yeah, well, like how Touchstone is a division of Disney, and how
right.
things like that. But that they're suddenly realizing maybe they need a more direct injection from the comic book division to create the right type of movie, because that's
been an ongoing effort for a number of years.
Sure.
When I was working in the creative services department, that was a large part of my job for a couple of years. Vetting the scripts for problems with multiple iterations of a franchise. For example, when you have a Superman cartoon show and you have Smallville going on at the same time as a Superman movie is being developed, so as to preserve the integrity of the brand, it becomes necessary to carve out territory that is sacrosanct to the other development. In other words, a large part of my job would be to say to the Smallville people, DC would prefer that you not go there because that's a key element in the upcoming film.
Okay.
In other words, DC was charged with the responsibility of helping to coordinate information about what aspect of the material was being exploited and communicated among the various divisions. That became such an important part of DC's role that Gregory Novak, who is Senior Vice President, I believe, Creative Affairs is his title.
Okay.
He was brought in, I believe, in 2004, and he is based primarily on the coast, and he is charged with overseeing the liaison between DC and Warner Brothers, but that's actually a very small part of his job now. He is, in a sense, a de facto producer. I only say that just to be careful because I don't want to misstate. I don't know whether he'll actually be carrying a producing credit or has carried a producing credit on the projects that he has spearheaded. But DC playing more of an active role on the production side. You are correct in perceiving that. It is not something that needs to be widely publicized in the sense of it's not necessarily something that you'll see in the average press release.
Right.
But DC, as we say in the book, DC has gone from being, I think the way it's put is a gnat buzzing in Warner Brothers' ear, to a respected and valuable contributor.
There you go. Exactly.
Because they certainly don't have the time to dig through the library.
Right.
So so there's a guy at DC now named Ivan Cohn, I believe, who does what I used to do in the sense of, okay, Chris Nolan wants to know about such and such a character. Can you put together a care package, as they used to call it? We would supervise the shipping of these huge boxes of comics.
Sure.
But it's much broader and much more sophisticated than that. And I guess the short form of it is, talking to somebody at DC probably gets you a better take on what your repeat business audience is going to think of your movie than talking to Harry Knowles.
Okay.
No disrespect to Harry Knowles.
No, I'm sure. I understand. Now, when you were there, I just finished an interview with Jeff Loeb a couple of weeks ago, and he had mentioned again when they...
a wonderful man and a wonderful writer.
He's a funny guy. He was telling me about when he was on Smallville, when they were thinking about bringing Chloe Sullivan into the comic books. And were you there when that was all being discussed?
Well, no. Well, I may well have been, but it wouldn't necessarily have been something that was on my radar.
Okay.
Jeff had a very unusual position in the sense that he was not only a major contributor to the television series, but he was also very much aware of what was going on in the comics.
Absolutely.
And very much plugged into that end of the world because he was a writer.
Yep.
So what I was more concerned about was, or rather, what I mean to say is what I was charged with monitoring was how did the Superman universe, as it was interpreted by the Smallville staff, stack up against what was being developed in the feature area and what was being done in animation.
Okay.
And it was a matter of just making sure that you don't play outside your sandbox and you don't step on somebody else's development.
Sure.
So how it worked in the other way.
Exactly. That's what I was wondering.
New material created in mass media and brought into the comics. That was strictly between editorial and the productions themselves.
Okay.
And usually, I think the way that worked was editorial would be guided by what Paul knew.
Okay.
But I was never brought into that, and that department I don't think really touches the comics that much.
Okay.
I can see a situation whereby the creative affairs department would have to facilitate a movie adaptation, and that has happened. When I wrote the Superman Returns comic book adaptation,
Mm-hmm.
Gregory himself had to intervene to get a lot of the supporting material and explain to the studio, no, you don't understand. We have a lead time. There's a point past which we can't be working on this. Presses only run so fast and so
Certainly.
on and so forth. So what we had to do was negotiate things like, well, we can't give you a visual reference for this because it's all in post. It's all in post-production. It's all CGI. We ourselves don't know
what it's going
to look like.
Okay.
And so the question would become, well, do you have some artist's renderings so we can figure out how to fake it? And then they go, oh, well, we don't know. And then that would be the point at which that department would have to step in and say, let's work it out in such a way that everybody is protected. Because there's a need to create the product, but as you know, there is so much fan interest in the content of this thing, and that if you have a surprise built into it, you have to guard this stuff like it's...
Oh, yeah.
I mean, yeah. I mean, I could tell you stories of getting movie scripts, and you have to sign out and practically have a retinal scan before they let you, look at it.
And
they're sent to you printed on. They're sent to you printed on, or rather, they are originally generated by what's called the Mimeo department, although there's no Mimeo
right.
involved anymore. They're printed on red paper, and you know why?
Because you can't photocopy red paper.
Exactly. And inevitably, you find yourself on the phone with a secretary saying, "Thank you for the script, but I can't read it."
I was going to say, man, you need good glasses to be able to read that stuff half the time.
Well, it's very dark gray with little black marks on it. So basically, what I'm saying is that whole operation has to coordinate these things so everybody's needs and they do a remarkable job of it, considering how much pressure there is involved because movies in themselves are expensive and special effects movies are much more expensive. And it's a very, very large operation. But it's an extremely well-oiled machine, and it's fascinating to be a part of it. If you have the long perspective of a fan, in the sense of no matter how young you are, you still have some interest, I think, in the history or some sense of it.
Absolutely.
It comes to you whether you want it or not. There is still that sense of, wow, who would have thought that this... Well, I have to correct myself. It is a generational thing. People who have a memory of the only iteration of their beloved superhero comics in the world outside of comics being the occasional board game, the occasional toy, and a very cheesy and obscure cartoon, where the animation is so limited that it consists of an arm going up and down.
Yeah.
People who have that frame of reference dream for years of a day when their favorite superheroes would be given the big budget treatment on the movie screen, and action figures and toys of all kinds, and it's all come to pass. Whether it's with the expanded licensing programs or things like DC Direct, which fills the gap of, our projections say we can't manufacture a Green Lantern, a Green Lantern replica in the right color that Walmart wants. So, and they won't take it anyway. But there's a ready-made market for this that will be willing to pay at retail far more than what Walmart thinks the upper-end price point for the thing is.
Absolutely.
You know, and so that was a masterstroke that you know, we chronicle in the last chapter of the book of the way DC has expanded, the amazing growth. One of the things that we've been asked is, why is the book weighted so heavily toward the early years, and the major events of the last 20 years seem to be covered in broad strokes? And the answer goes directly to what the point of the book is. The DC Vault is about exposing little-known curios and using them to illustrate a history of the company with a focus, we hope, on the never before heard or seen. Now it can be told was the field that we were going for.
I hear you.
Succeeded or not, again, as I say, I'll leave that up to the reader. But with the Internet and the passionate interest of DC's many fans, anything you want to know in any kind of detail about what has gone on in the last 20 years is available to you.
You bet.
And since, as I said before, covering a 75 history and 75-year history in only 20,000 words, obviously something has to be, you know, it has to be left out or has to be summarized in broader terms. We tried to leave nothing important out. But I think that we succeeded in addressing the goal of exposing the readership to things that they won't be able to find anywhere else. And as I say, we did that by prevailing upon a vast army of collectors to share with us their materials long enough to be very, very carefully photographed. Some of it by a wonderful photographer named Mark Witz. I don't want to. I have this desire to give credit where credit is due, but I understand now what Oscar winners in their acceptance speeches, what they mean when they say, "I want to thank you, but I know I'll leave somebody out, so I won't thank anybody." And then, of course, nobody's happy.
Well, that's what the acknowledgments are for inside the book and everything. But no,
yes, and they're in very small type because there's so many people that we are so grateful to.
Well, that's cool. It really. I congratulate you guys because it really is. It's an amazing book, and as you say, it does cover the past in a way that isn't covered elsewhere. And you don't know where you're going if you don't know where you've been, and that's the point I think of this book, and I think it succeeds. So
well, my hat's off to you for spreading that message.
My pleasure, man. It's Christmas time. I mean, this is a good idea for a gift if you got somebody that really is a DC fan, and I mean, it's the replicated collectibles that are inside are as amazing as the text itself, and the beautiful pictures that start with.
Well, they're much more amazing. They're the raison d'etre for the book. I'm just filling the space around the pictures.
No, but you're telling the story, man, and I think it's a cool story, and that's the thing. Again, you really don't know DC until you really check this book out. And as you say, there have been other histories of comics and stuff, but I think this point of view is a very important one. That again, the supplementary material only illustrates what you've written about, and it's a great story and really interesting facts. And I mean, any person that really does love comics would really appreciate, again, seeing some of this stuff for the first time and really understanding where a lot of these ideas first came from and how they were exploited and in the different ways that they were exploited, and also just the incredible art from the early pages to the Jam poster that has people as varied as Bob Kane and Dave Gibbons. I mean, you've got a Bob Kane Batman standing in the same group with Dave Gibbons Rorschach, and I mean, it's that kind of span of history that we're seeing in this book. So, hats off to you, Marty. Nice job. And honestly, next year when it is the 75th anniversary, we should really come back and talk more about the company's full history and get into some more of the stories because. I envy you for being where you've been in the company and seeing a lot of the different changes and all the different people that have come through the door. And you're one of the guys, man. You were writing the books, and also observed a lot of the great art and writing that was going on around you as well. So,
well, I think there's a group of us who believe very much in the idea of pay it forward. I know Paul Levitz endorses that tremendously. He has a much more acute sense than any of us of how much of the history of the company is dependent upon oral history. And so there's a group of us who, as I said, are a member of the last generation of people who had any contact with the founding fathers of the industry. And what we remember, even though it's secondhand oral history, is an oral history. And we have one of our own because, people who worked in the 70s, the youngest of us who worked in the 70s are now speaking for that era, because more and more of the people who were seminal figures in the changes between the 70s and the 80s that built the reconfigured comic book industry that we know today are passing on.
Yeah.
And what I and people who many of my friends and colleagues who feel the same way are proud to do and feel a sense of an obligation to do is to be able to do, if we can, for the generations that come after us, what people like Bill Finger were doing in a 2-hour conversation in the bullpen with this kid who was gaga at the idea of talking about it.
That's awesome. Well, thanks for your time, Marty. I mean,
Thank you.
I've been keeping you up, and I don't want to...
No. My pleasure, and I thank you for your interest.
There you go, my buddy, the late, great Marty Pasko from a few years back, discussing the DC Vault. Once again, tonight on Word Balloon Live, really happy to welcome Joe Casey back to Word Balloon. He has a brand new book, Junior Baker. We're going to talk about that. We'll talk about his thoughts on the writer's strike. I hope to see Spider-Verse between now and when I speak to Joe, so that I can ask him his thoughts as a guy that has spent a long time now in the animation business, his thoughts on the Spider-Verse movie. Does it inspire him to try things differently from a visual standpoint? A whole bunch more. I'm really looking forward to it. I had his Man of Action co-conspirator, Steve Siegel, on a few weeks ago, and I'm always happy to have Joe back on Word Balloon. God, Joe was one of those first-year guests that I'm like, I can't believe I'm talking to Joe Casey. This is incredible. When you consider his history at both DC and Marvel, and, what he's been doing for the last 20-plus years in animation, creating Ben 10 and Generation Rex, and so much more. So I hope you join us tonight for this great conversation live. Joe Casey, it's going to be at 10 o'clock Eastern, 9 p.m. Central, and 7 o'clock Pacific time. And that'll be on Word Balloon's YouTube channel, and you can watch via Facebook and Twitter. So I hope you join us tonight for the Joe Casey conversation. More great stuff coming this week on Word Balloon. I hope you'll join us. July just getting started, and so is Word Balloon with a new slate of great conversations. Until next time, thanks for listening. Word Balloon is a copyright feature of Shaky Productions, copyright 2023.